Hello, it's Aaron, and welcome back to the podcast. My guest today is Michael Foster, pastor of East River Church in Batavia, Ohio. I got to be careful. I keep wanting to say Batavia, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago. I lived there for a long time. It's Batavia, Ohio, which is just east of Cincinnati. You remember him? May remember Michael because I've had him on the show before. You may be also a follower of his on Twitter. This is Foster on Twitter and Substack. I'll throw links to that in the show notes. Michael, thanks you for joining me.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
Another kind of experimental podcast today. Again, usually I have kind of a script with some questions because I'm talking to somebody about their book or whatever. But I just wanted to get you on to talk in general about what's been going on over the last 5 years and 6 years and try to make some sense out of the cultural moment that we're in. So we'll just see where this takes us because it really has been a wild ride in so many
Yeah.
ways. I think when did you start East River Church?
So East River Church started in earnest on December of 2020, right? So I was in South Carolina at a PCA church from 2014. Then we returned home late 2019. Took a year off to decide if we wanted to plant a church. In the middle of that, that was probably the height of It's Good to Be a Man's podcast. And that eventually led to the publishing of the book in 2020. 2020 was a big year for me. It was the year that the church got planted, was the year that the book came out. That's when I did all those Manosphere conferences that people like to bring up still to this day. Um, that's when I started meeting a lot of the online influencers kind of in that space. And my Twitter started growing pretty rapidly. And I think it was kind of caught a wave before other people did. The wave hadn't crested yet of the manosphere. One way that I think I would sum up 2018ish was almost like the height of woke, right? It was or where woke was seeming really strong and like we would never break it. Maybe you can go back a few years before that, but it was really strong. So to have anyone come out and speak on sexuality the way we did, certainly um, kind of interacting with a lot of the pagan ideals that was coming up through the manosphere that young men were getting into, young Christian men even. Um, that was like kind of groundbreaking in certain circles. And then when the pandemic happened, that kind of all the stuff that I had been working on just exploded onto the scene, and that happened to a lot of different people at that time. So that's East River was kind of born in the middle of the pandemic. The sort of like pushback against woke that has now, I don't know how total the victory is, but things have changed, right? So yeah.
Yeah, so I maybe had the timing wrong. I thought you had the church started before It's Good to Be a Man, but you started It's Good to Be a Man first. I probably found you through that because I started seeing the Manosphere getting popular in 2013
Yep.
and the early blog version of the Manosphere. And that led me to start my newsletter probably 2016 2017 timeframe. Like the church is not even in the game for what is drawing young men. And oh, by the way, although this manosphere has got a lot of issues, a lot of problems, I can also see that what the church is saying has got a lot of problems, and we need to fix that too. How did you get interested or discover kind of men's issues in this kind of manosphere thing?
So my early interest in sexuality goes back to my freshman year at Northern Kentucky University in a sociology class that I took. Um, and that's where I got introduced to radical feminism, and I started reading all those books while also reading the church fathers. And the church fathers were very concerned about physicality. A lot of their sense of redemption really is the redemption of physical things. And so that was so different from what I was hearing in the charismatic church I had gone to, that I just became really fascinated with all aspects of human sexuality. but it was kind of more of an academic, detached from practicality sort of interest. Then probably the next big jump is Emily and I had some marriage problems, and I got a hold of Reforming Marriage by Doug Wilson, which was the only Doug Wilson book I read until like 17 years later.
It's still
So
the
that
only
book,
Doug Wilson book I've read.
yeah. So I read, I think I read two or three others. Future Men's Good and Rules for Reformers is all right, you know. But anyhow,
His book, I remember reading that book. I mean, probably 2012 or something like that. And I remember even at the time thinking this idea that like his take on the book of Numbers where the husband can revoke his wife's contract within 24 hours. I said that seems a little odd to say that. But
he was
I
willing to go
that's
there,
just,
man. He was willing to go places that people weren't. Because I had
he
read,
still is.
he is, and I had read Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, and I hated that book. And I just thought, I feel like I liked Paige Patterson's chapter, but it's been such a long time since I read it. I just remember that the chapter that Piper wrote, I found very unhelpful, very obtuse, very hard to apply. And I picked up Reforming Marriage off the shelf at Barnes and Noble or something like that, and that's how I got that book and read it. And I thought that was pretty helpful. But I was an early Dalrock reader, you know,
Yeah.
so I was reading
I
Dalrock.
read, full disclosure, I read his entire archives. I have a copy of it. It disappeared for a while.
Yeah,
And so I have an entire copy of his archives there. And I got a lot of issues with Dalrock,
sure,
but he
sure.
was devastating his critiques of the church for sure.
Dalrock is best to he's he's an expert in the cancer that is feminism, but he rarely gave any cures, right? Like he
No, he
mostly
was a
studied the
nihilist at the end of the day.
yeah. He was pretty negative, but um, he was so good at summing up what you were seeing, and he was way ahead of a whole lot of people. He was, and then Tim Bailey was my pastor for a while. Tim Bailey is one of the early. He may be the first executive chair of or executive director
He was
of
the first
Council.
executive director, yeah,
Yeah, of
of
Biblical
Council for
Manhood.
Biblical Manhood and Womanhood.
So, and Tim had some good insights. Tim's his age. He belongs to a certain generation. Um, but so all those guys are kind of like I was in that, and started to click on some of the people that were commenting on Dalrock, and I found all that stuff. I actually got connected to you. I found out you existed because I was talking to my friend David Talcott about some of the red pill stuff I was thinking through. He's like, "Man, you need to talk to my friend Aaron Renn." And I subscribed to your newsletter around issue 14 or something. It was pretty
Mhm.
early. Um, and then we eventually talked. I can remember talking to you. I was in my South Carolina lake house on the lake, talking to you right down by the lake. So I kind of slowly got pulled into all this stuff, and having kind of been discipled by boomers, which is, I'm one of these guys that actually had fairly good boomers in his life that discipled me. But one thing I always noticed about them is that they have a hard time realizing how bad women have gotten, right? So they only think of men as dogs, right? As
Mhm.
guys that are like these horn dogs that are running all around. They don't know how loose women have gotten in America and how scandalous it was. And I every time I
I
talk
mean,
to them,
men are pretty bad. Let's be, yeah, there's a lot of bad men, but
sure,
women today are not, pining away just waiting for the guy who's going to court them at home
no,
to be the
no,
faithful, devoted wife. I mean, it's a completely different environment, cultural
it
environment.
it it,
The
it really
boomers
is
can't even
different.
understand it.
It's hard for them to comprehend. And I can remember, like, they basically, the reason girls couldn't find guys is because all the guys were terrible, right? I'm like, that's not true. There's good guys out there. There's a lot of bad guys. But do you guys understand how bad some of these women are? And so they're bad in their sort of promiscuity, but also that internet, the dating apps, and Instagram and all that. I would say right around 2000, right around 2013 as well. I was realizing that these women just had these crazy. I wrote this article that did really well called the death of the well-suited couple, where I was talking about how back in high school there'd be a fat guy and a fat girl, and they would date, and everyone would think it's cute, and they would date through high school and get married and have this life or whatever. Nowadays, a woman who is she has a very inflated sense of what she can get out on the market because of dating apps and because of Instagram guys and girls telling her how beautiful they are. And so these girls who I thought were not that attractive were passing on these guys that were fit, were smart, were educated and all that. And I was trying to understand what was going on. There was just a huge shift. I remember there being a huge shift after I got out of high school with my friends' younger sisters. And we all knew some loose girls in school, but the stuff that we were hearing just a few years into the 2000s was kind of mind blowing, like how quick things were shifting. And there's a lot of thought that has something to do with girls' access to cell phones. And I read an article on that somewhere. I need to go dig up again. But anyhow, going back to all this, it for me, I was trying to figure out how I could help my friends get married and find good women and navigate a really insanely shifting dating environment, and that's all that started coalescing through the teens of the 2000s into when we started It's Good to Be a Man. We started pretty early with this idea of like a theology of attraction, and that
Mhm.
that really caught well. So all that
I mean,
stuff.
that's the
So I think,
missing link, and one of the missing links in the church world is just no concept of how attraction works. Or actually, it's an unwillingness to directly state how it works. They actually know how it works, but they say that's not how it should work. So,
yeah,
ergo, you should act as though the world works differently than it actually does, which is really um, not good. I definitely think the internet, it's not just the dating apps, although they're bad. I do think the manosphere and the women's influencer world have both had a negative effect on the dynamics of couples. Just like I'm more familiar with the manosphere. Uh, the women's influencer space, I don't know as much, but I open the New York Times and it's every day. It's like you should dump your wonderful husband to become self actualized and stuff like that. But the manosphere was also like, all women are damaged goods. They suck. The modern woman's horrible. Uh, which is not true. There's plenty of like challenging women out there that you wouldn't want to marry or you wouldn't want to date. There are actually good women out there too, and I think
yeah,
that's what's missing. That was what got me about Dalrock. There's a big parallel between Dalrock and Rollo Tomasi, another one of these figures. And they, of course, are very good friends, and it's just suspicious parallels between them in the sense that both of them had a hyper nihilistic view of relationships.
hmm,
There's no possibility that you're going to marry a good woman who's not going to treat you this way, etc. Every single pastor is terrible.
yeah.
Even Doug Wilson and Tim Bennett are all terrible. But nevertheless, I somehow managed to marry a beautiful, hot wife who's submissive and loves me. I have the dream marriage that you can never have. I really thought that was like they practiced the whole uh, the only real man in the room thing, which is what
Yep.
Dalrock used to point out that like a lot of these guys like Driscoll, they had this "I'm the only real man in the room" kind of persona, but that was what they did. It's like I'm the only one who could possibly have this wonderful idyllic marriage. The rest of you guys are doomed because women are terrible. And
Yep.
I do think if I were going to have a critique of the manosphere, I do think one of them is its incredibly negative view of women, both in terms of who they are and the transactional, extractive view of women. This is where the church, I think, could really add something, to say the least, to the mix. But I think the same thing happened on the women's side. I'm less familiar with the influencer space than you are, but it's like none of these guys are good enough for you.
Yeah.
They all suck. Here's what you deserve. You need to hold out for the best, even if you yourself are not the best. It's like,
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
deserve the 10 out of 10 guy, and I guess you'll be better off being single and you'll travel and you'll do this and you'll do that. And it's no surprise all these terrible things have happened.
Yeah, 100%. And again, there's a sort of swinging uh, back that the younger generations, in particular, like mid-20s and down, maybe even a little bit younger than that. So my oldest son will be 19 in the fall, and I'm getting to know how his friends think, and he's in my son. I imagine my son will probably be married sometime by the end of next year, but
Hmm.
uh, but I'm seeing these young people really go kind of traditional. The number of weddings that we've done in the last couple of years is pretty crazy, and I've got a bunch here in the fall coming up. Um, and as I talk to them, they are finding the girls want to go back to not just this weird trad cath online or trad wife online performativeness, but there really is a genuine returning because they've watched their older siblings or uncles or whatever and aunts just get ravaged. And I don't know what percentage. I couldn't know what. I'm just telling you the sample of the population I'm dealing with seems much more conservative in practice too. That they're wanting to get married sooner. That the girls are responding to guys in a more positive way. It's still a tricky environment, but it wasn't what it was just like 6 or 7 years ago, or 8 years ago. It does seem to be a real switch has happened, and I think some of that is because of the online content. I do think, guys are more brutal than they've ever been in these group chats. I have to
Yeah.
tell my son, like, don't be that intense, but they will shame each other for not taking their health seriously. They'll shame each other for not like having drive and ambition. They'll push each other. They'll warn each other about bad, like, you don't want no part of that girl. The guys are kind of what I remember back when I was in high school, right? And there's like a real sort of bro code coming right now. So I think some of that is they have learned from some of this online content, but they struggle still in the practical, like, here's
Yeah.
how you get married, here's what a good marriage looks like. But the a more realistic understanding of intersexual dynamics does seem to be rising up in the younger generation. It's been my
Yeah.
observation.
And people even more openly talk about these things in the major media now. It's not as taboo a topic, and things of that, like the idea of Riz. Like that's one that I just think is such like
Yeah.
is like charisma as this thing. I think a couple of things have happened to the Manosphere space maybe since the late teens. One is there was a turnover as everything shifted to video and YouTube. And now there's a whole generation of new people that are basically YouTube people, whereas the original ones were kind of blog Twitter guys.
Hmm.
And it kind of broadened. So you got like Rogan, and there's still some traditional kind of really edgy pods like Fresh and Fit or whatever, which I just can't handle like a 4 hour or like a 7 hour. Like, yeah, who even has time to watch a Joe Rogan episode? I know. So there's a lot more kind of that. And I think a lot of these guys got older. Take a guy like Mike Cernovich. He wasn't like a game blogger per se. I mean, he kind of had like a narrow window there, but like he got
Danger
older.
in play.
He got older, got married, had kids. Rush Valizadeh, who was one of the big pickup artists from back in the day. He was one of the founders of this movement. He got older. He's like, wow, this lifestyle's empty. He basically converted to Christianity, unpublished all of his books. I think he's disappeared now. But like they started having the guys that got older aged out of some of their
Hmm. Hmm.
ideas, and there are people now repping you should get married and have kids. This is so much more valuable. So there are more voices, I think, in that now in the online space. But
I
yeah.
saw a clip from the guy that plays Saul Goodman. His name escapes me right now. Um, but he said they asked him who he's jealous of, and he said, "I'm jealous of anyone who still has little kids in the household." Right. And then I've seen a lot of that sort of, like, it's good to have kids, it's good to get married. A lot of that kind of just really intense switch that it's kind of interesting to watch. Like I don't know what big Eva sort of evangelical Christians are going to do because it really runs contra the sort of singleness, the gift of
Gift of
singleness
singleness.
that they pressed so hard for so many years, which I think was just a cope to help all the single women in their church not like overthrow them, you know. But so anyhow, now it's a really mind blowing thing that we're living through. Um, it's interesting during the pandemic. You could build a. So I have this theory that so I work for a transformer company, and we really grew during the pandemic. We're newer, we're a startup, so it was easier for us to pivot and change and all that. But one thing that we definitely had was a lot of stateside inventory that other people didn't have. And so we weren't as dependent upon, foreign sources. But, these days manufacturing is always global for the most part. So things did affect us, but not the way it affected our kind of just in time competitors. And so we were able to grab up huge portions of the market because we had inventory. I think Canon Press, in my estimation, their
That's
friends,
kind
but
of the
look,
Doug Wilson
yeah,
Moscow
that's right.
publishing company. For those who don't
So
know.
so watching them, they kind of had their heyday during the pandemic, and I highly doubt that their subscription level or whatever is as steep now as it was going up during the pandemic. And that's because everyone had this sort of eye-opening moment, and they really wanted to understand the scriptural basis for how the church should interact with the civil magistrate, with government.
Hmm.
And they had they had a lot of inventory. They had a lot of books on that, a lot of podcasts, a lot of blog posts on that. So suddenly it grabbed up a ton of market. Anyone that was edgy, back, just a few years ago, you couldn't say gay and retarded and not pay for it. But Shane Gillis built a career on it. But it's already now. I mean, during the pandemic, if you were edgy at all, you could kind of gain an audience. If you felt like you're the guy that's willing to take the risk and say the truth that no one else will, you could gain this huge because you had this inventory of non-PC, and people like, I want to buy that up. So there's all this incredible growth that happened during this market disruption that cut across all verticals and all different areas of society. Then people kind of thought was going to stay that way. And
Hmm.
and so one thing that I remember, I had a guy call me and he wanted to buy a single phase pad mount. This is a transformer. Single phase pad mounts you use to bring single phase power to like a housing development. They're also used in large renewable solar fields. And there was a lot of growth in both renewables and all these housing developments in late 2019, 2018. And then I remember a guy called me begging for one, and I just bought it. I didn't really know how to price it, and so I like priced it super high, just because that way I know I'm not going to get in trouble getting this wrong. And he's like, oh, thank God, I'll take it. Now, as a salesman, I hate hearing that. Like, I never want anyone to be super relieved when they hear the price. I want to
Right.
hear something like, okay, I'll do it. Right. Then I'm like, all right. So I was like, man, that's weird. What's going on? Well, then during the pandemic, there was a shutdown on all these factories or slowdown at the very least. And suddenly, single phase pad mounts, they went from being just a few weeks lead time to like a year and a half. Right. And everyone was saying, single phase pad mounts will never be the same again. It'll never be. The supply chain has changed forever, right? And for a time, it's like, I'm sorry, there's no way to get that. It's just going to be a long time. Then I don't know if it was a year or 2 years ago, I saw something I never thought I would see in my entire life, which was an ad for a buy one get one free single phase pad mount. Right, these
Hmm.
are huge pieces of metal, right? These are gigantic things. It's not like a pair of shoes or something. You never would have imagined that. And that's when I realized, first off, everyone depends on that supply chain working. The number of high people, big companies, there's a sort of if it's not fixed, it's mutually assured destruction. So everyone is going to work to fix it. And people thought things would never go back to stasis. And they're wrong. These systems are gigantic and they involve so many things working together. And so whoever had the inventory gained a falling, but whoever thought things wouldn't arrive at some new normal is is going to be in trouble if they don't pivot and they don't figure that out. And I think you see that happening right now where that we're arriving at a new normal. Like, for example, if you're a transformer company and you have transformers and no one else does, you can charge whatever you want. We didn't do that. We were smart. We knew we didn't want to. We thought people would remember us overcharging, but you could have like kind of not the world's best customer service, and people would still put up with it because they need the transformer. Their project doesn't happen. But when everyone has transformers, they start to expect excellence, in customer service, in logistics, and all that sort of stuff. Like early, it's good to be a man. I recorded that stuff on my phone, like in my car, right? Like I just had put some headphones on and talked to my phone and didn't edit it. I threw it up and people listened to it because there wasn't anything out there now like that. But now everyone has these studios or through AI, people can make everything sound really nice, and there's a sort of expectation that that it should have better sound quality, and if you don't have that, you're not going to be able to compete in the marketplace. So I think right now culturally we're going through this incredible shift back to kind of stasis. It reminds me of post 9/11. The flags went up, everyone was a patriot, and then the flags came down. And I'm not saying things haven't changed, but even to take some risk here, no matter what you believe about the Epstein lists, right? The fact that that's being taken out of the conversation by Trump and all these people, that to me is like, well, that's a sort of return to conservatives and liberals working together. Let's not talk about that anymore. Let's not talk about, like, let's just kind of remove that and move on to some sort of like regular normal political situation. So to me, we're we went through this huge shift during the pandemic, and now I don't think it's going to keep happening at the rate. And we're in a new world that 2025 is starting to show us. I thought if Trump got elected, the Christian nationalism movement would take quite a hit, because MAGA would. It was a very reactionary movement. It was very powerful when you had like Biden and Kamala in there. I'm not saying that bears on whether it's right or wrong, but as a movement, I thought MAGA just really ate its lunch and took the air out of it. And I think what we see happening right now is a breakdown in pandemic coalitions. And also, I think Shane Gillis is going to have to kind of change up his act. I think that edginess isn't going to be, it's kind of commonplace already. Like it's really shifted quickly. And I don't know how this relates to the conversation we started out on totally, but maybe that there was the world pre-pandemic, the world um, pre-Christians starting to get into the manosphere. And now we're in a whole nother place that
Yeah.
I'm still trying to get my bearings on.
Yeah, I think in general the culture. Let me give my kind of like spiel on the culture, which is very similar to yours. Is when the pandemic hit, people were like, "It's never going back." Well, first off, we're like I think it's like a year and a half in, and we're still shut down, and nobody's going back to the office, and people are like, "It's never going back." I had a airline executive like talking about air travel, and it's basically like it's over. It's never coming back. We're it's just of course now we have record air travel.
Yeah.
So is it the same air travel we had before? No. So it's sort of like everybody abandoned New York in the pandemic. It's the city emptied out. You could get rents for unbelievable dirt cheap rents in New York. People moved out to the country. They're moving out to their estates. It's 100% remote work. 50, 80 companies were going remote, 100% remote. And now it's sort of reversing a little bit. So New York rents have never been higher. The city is jam packed. There's just an article in the Financial Times about all these people who bought these country homes in the UK. They're now all going back on the market because they're like, man, I don't like living in the country, or I have to be back in the office. The companies are bringing them back to the office. I was just in New York City. It's never looked better than it
Hmm.
does right now. So people who are thinking, oh, New York is dead, it wasn't true. Now, here's what I'd say is we're not back in 2019. We are
Hmm.
in a different place. Remote
Yes.
hybrid work has changed the game. The geographical map has been redone. There was a shift to the suburb. There was a shift in the culture. There has been a vibe shift in the culture. But things are not, it's not 2021
Mm-mm.
anymore. And the people who think that the same playbook is going to keep working and working and working is just not going to do it. And I would say for the returns to edginess are not as high when Donald Trump is in the White House.
No, not
It's
at
sort of
all.
like I want to be this like edgy. Being an edgy person is built on sort of being a marginal outside figure, and so when you build your whole thing on edginess, well, one, you're always gonna be that. But the other thing is like when the culture shifts and like your shtick doesn't work anymore. It's like George Carlin wouldn't be doing the 7 words you can't say on television right now if he
Yeah.
were around today. It's like saying those words doesn't mean anything any anymore.
I was thinking about the Reform Network, GRM, which is a kind of a group inside the PCA, the
Basically, a
Presbyterian Church in
conservative
America.
network inside the PCA.
Yeah. Was what was interesting is that they're kind of going after Christian nationalism a little bit right now. Um, and I don't really think that's a huge. It's not a huge. It doesn't make sense to me that they're going after it when they came on the scene really to answer the revoice controversy that was happening in the PCA, basically the idea of gay celibate Christianity. They had this like clear enemy, right? This clear issue they had to tackle. And to everyone's shock, it wasn't clean the way it got done, but ultimately the PCA did deal with revoice for the most part and did get that the main advocates out of their denomination and had a pretty huge victory there. And and then it seemed to me like the GRN's like, and some of these guys are going to disagree with me who are friends of mine, but it seemed like, what do we do now? Who's the enemy? Who do we fight against? And I think what's interesting at this moment is people are trying to figure out who are allies and enemies again because things as they change uh, are shifting everywhere, and folks are trying to find out what the next thing is. And it's been weird to watch kind of coalitions break down online or people pick very strange fights. I mean, it's like happening everywhere right now. At least in the kind of influence writer content producer space, I see it the most. But it's just we're in a brand new territory, and I was thinking about how many of the talking points that I was going on about 8 or 9 years ago, I hear megachurch pastors talking about it all the time. And that's when I mean, those guys know, they know where the culture is going. That's why their churches are so big. They're so big because they know where the culture is going, and they're incredibly talented communicators that know how to take resonating ideas and package them for a mass audience. That's really, if you listen to them, you're like, yeah, they're awesome communicators. You can say whatever you want to say, but that lets you know that things are shifting so radically. Um, and I don't know where we're going. I mean, you and I've talked about it on the phone
Yeah,
before, multiple times, but
I
it's
think
been
we've
kind of
been
fun.
talking like for 2 years that
Yeah.
we've been in this liminal space where the old has kind of been in decay. The old global globalist order, if you want to call it that, is kind of in decline. The old kind of movements in the church are in decline. Many of the leaders are they're dying or they're old
Mm-hmm.
now.
Mm-hmm.
We know that at some point there's going to be generational turnover, but we still have all these boomers kind of running everything. But we don't know what the new fully looks like yet. I don't think today's can. It wasn't the pandemic model that became the new thing, but I don't know what the new thing is. We've seen these shifts, but it's still kind of dynamic and emerging. We see things like AI. What's that going to do? What's it really going to mean when there aren't any boomers, around anymore? We know that like New Calvinism, which in the church was this massive, hugely influential movement, that's clearly kind of it's kind of become its own little like subculture now. It's no longer culturally influential,
Mm-hmm.
but there is no new thing like that that's emerged. Here's the
Not at all.
new thing in the church, and maybe part of it is all the new things were created by boomers who knew how to create things. You cannot sell them short at knowing how to create institutions,
Not at all.
movements, etc. And they were the younger generations haven't figured out how to do that. But so it's sort of like I feel like we're in this space where it's really really uncertain. Again, there is a lot of infighting between people who you would have said were friends not that long ago. And I try to stay out of it for the most
Yep.
part, but there are
Yep. Same here.
people who used to say nice things about me that don't say nice things about me anymore. And I'm like, whatever. Some of these guys, I'm like, I really like that guy. I'm not going to criticize him just because he doesn't like me. I'm not going to let that control my opinion of him. And too much conflict is not healthy. But I do think there is this sort of like, particularly with Trump in the White House, the decline of woke. Now it's like all these people on the right are basically turning on each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of what's happening basically is the people who are sort of the dissidents who broke up the ice, right? So that the ship could start moving again. Kind of like it's not quite Trump's first term, but those people are not going to be part of the new configuration most likely. They're going to be left behind. And you can see many of them are not happy about that. Is sort of
Mm-hmm.
the carpetbaggers come in, the people with the networks, the money, the connections, the institutions, and they're kind of taking over this thing, and they're just using it for kind of what they want to do. And it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see.
Pandemic Christianity to me is very reminiscent of the emerging church. So the emerging church is this sort of sub movement that's happening during the start of the young, restless, and reformed.
Kind of
It's
really
got
got
guys
going
like
in the '90s.
yeah, so you got like Doug Paget, Brian McLaren, a bunch of other people. Um, it really was late '90s. Driscoll at one point would say that was a stream. I remember Ed Stetzer saying that there's all these different streams of emergent or whatever. But the real reason emergent Christianity never made a huge impact, right? So it had some pretty big books, right? A New Way to Be a Christian by McLaren was a bestseller, and there's a Ancient Future Church or something did really well, but they had some really well selling books, maybe some popular websites there for a moment, but they really never created any institutions. Whereas, and so they've all disappeared. And then you got guys like Colin Hansen, who are still very much around. And the gospel, you got the Gospel Coalition. It really kind of rises up through the Young, the Reformed, and Restless, and they still have 6, 7, 8,000 people showing up to their conferences. And I think these the Young, and Reformed, and Restless guys did have some institutions that they built. The emerging church didn't. They had a couple big hits on some books, and I look at pandemic Christianity, the sort of the new right or whatever it was. They didn't really create like a new denomination or not. There wasn't even the biggest books were your book, Megan Basham's book, Stephen Wolf's book. Maybe I don't know. Those are the three big books I can think of that came out of that time in the Christian circles. And none of that really produced. There wasn't any like defining book like Wild at Heart or Desiring God or anything that really crystallized a movement yet. So no
Why don't
institutions.
we get in trouble here? Because
Okay.
you again were in Greenville. You went to Greenville Seminary. You were in the
Okay.
PCA, and you went to plant a church in Cincinnati. And you did not decide to do it in the PCA. You decided to do it in the CREC, which was Doug Wilson's denomination.
Yep.
And I think I shouldn't call it that because he doesn't really, he's not the Pope of the actual denomination, but
He
that's the
really
perception.
isn't. Yeah.
But,
But
but
that's
what I would
yeah.
say is, I think there was a sense at that time that the PCA, kind of the conservative Presbyterian denomination, the main conservative Presbyterian denomination, was sort of drifting in a liberal direction. Churches were starting to leave and form splinter groups. And with the pandemic, it did look like the CREC could be the new thing for these sort of conservatives, and that they could come
Yep.
in and all these churches could be there. And they sort of, I think, had an opportunity to claim a lot of territory, but they didn't do it. And instead, they sort of seem to have alighted on doubling down on all of their theological peculiarities that are the
Hmm.
reasons people didn't like them in the first place, because they had these sort of like oddball theologies around infants taking communion and things like that. And then so it seems like they could have been an institution that became big, but it didn't.
Yeah, very much so. Well,
And
I
you left
think
that denomination, so maybe you could talk
I
about
did.
about that
Yeah,
kind of.
absolutely. Well, I think the people that you thought were going to be winners in the pandemic, it's not panning out that way, right?
Mhm.
Like, and who are the winners? We're I'm using these winner losers in a very, I'm talking in the sense of growing influence and lasting to stability and stuff like that when I mean that. So in 2019, there were like PCA ruling elders and teaching elders participating in Black Lives Matter marches. There was Revoice. There was a lot of people getting in trouble just for things they said online or whatever. Um, and had I stayed in a more conservative presbytery, I probably would have stayed in the PCA. I had a really positive experience in the PCA. I still, I defended them on the whole throughout that time, but there was real problems, and it looked like there it wasn't going to come back, right? So the Series C, I asked one of their influential pastors who's since passed away, a guy named Greg Strawbridge. I'm like, hey, I'm not a covenant renewal worship guy. I'm not a paedo communion guy. I'm not a theonomist. Um, I'm just a vanilla Westminsterian Presbyterian that appreciates some of your social stands that you've taken. Is there a place for me? And oh, sure, sure. So we had all those conversations, and came in the more Presbyterian side of the Series C, I definitely really, if you go out to Moscow, their worship's much closer to a PCA service than a lot of people would know. But then there was like a very Anglican side to the Series C as well. Um,
Yeah,
and
a
that
lot of their
was,
guys are wearing clerical collars, or
yeah,
full
yeah,
time, and
yeah,
it's
yeah,
interesting.
yeah. So I was like, well, I don't really fit with that. And that, I would say that's at least a simple majority, if not more, of the Series C. But the Series C, the reason it grew so much is because most of their churches stayed open during the pandemic, and they spoke boldly to the pressing issues. I think
If you
some
were
of
a
the people
church that was meeting during the pandemic,
you
you
grew,
grew massively in
you grew.
size.
And I remember hearing some people say, well, the reason we grew is because of our sacramentology and our eschatology. So paid of communion and that they're post mill. And I was like, no, that's not true, because tons of Calvary chapels that are Credo Baptist, Credo Communion, and premillennial and their eschatology, they grew a ton too, right? They're exact opposite. It was if you had a doctrine of worship, of public worship, and you were willing to call that stuff out. There's a guy named Rob McCoy, who's a friend of mine that's in the Calvary Chapel. Their church grew tons, and so I think a lot of people, and I think this is true of some of the people in this area. See, not all of them, um, that they didn't understand what was actually resonating with people and what was driving their growth, right? And everyone wanted to believe is their uh, what made them the thing that was peculiar about them is what everyone was into, and the Overton window shifting, and now everyone's into this stuff, and I think a lot of that happened during the pandemic, and now we're watching people kind of as the coalition breaks down, as things grew really quick. So with the CRC, the reason I think they did what they did is that a lot of them said, "Hey, we have this very particular identity, right? That's formed around these things that matter to us. Paedo communion would be a big one, but there's other things too. And now we've got all these guys that aren't like that are coming in because they value us for these other reasons. This may change our identity forever if we get overwhelmed by these kind of outsiders that appreciate us for some things, right? They're probably not wrong, right?
Hmm.
They probably that would have happened actually, and they had to decide what makes the CREC like its own thing, and so they doubled down on some things that mattered to them to protect their long-term identity, and so a lot of people were faced with, do I want to do something different? Do I want to do something new? Do I really want to create a new coalition? Am I willing to do what it takes during the pandemic? And a lot of people weren't willing to change. And uh, in some ways, you respect it. In other ways, you're like, well, that was also kind of a missed opportunity. And that's where we're at right now, is watching everything kind of, so many of these churches that were planted during the pandemic were started by ruling elders or small groups of people, and they still don't have pastors. I suspect that a lot of the churches that were planted during the pandemic will have a higher failure rate. I don't care what denomination it was in, because I think they were brought together by kind of shared enemies, shared kind of social doctrine, not deeply held cardinal doctrines that really drive the engine of that church. I think you're going to see the pandemic is going to be really hard to explain to people, because I think there's a real move to just bury it at all and
Oh,
to
like
forget
it's
it
like
even
all
happened.
classic
Like,
moral panics.
yeah.
Just like the witch burnings or the
Hmm.
satanic. We're just gonna like pretend that didn't happen because too many people are implicated. We're just gonna
Yep.
declare a amnesty amnesia
Hmm.
on that, which I think is actually a mistake because it's just draining. It's part of what has just drained legitimacy out of the system, that the people who made really, really bad decisions in the pandemic are coming out of it having suffered no personal price for that, professional
Yep.
price, and even that. So it's like that's why a lot of our cities are going down the tubes right now. I mean, that they're not literally going out of business. We have a lot of cities got a lot of problems, and part of it is they've never reckoned with the bad decisions that their leaders have
Hmm.
made, and not just
Hmm.
bad mayors, the whole slew of them. But yeah, I think you're right. And if you created a church that was like attuned to a pandemic moment, we're not in the pandemic moment anymore.
In 2022, that was kind of this. So in my kind of narrow um, pond that I'm my closest, my inner circle of people that I associate with. I'm a Reformed Presbyterian, kind of far right Presbyterian. Um, at County Before Country in 2022, which was a conference I had, you were actually there, and I noticed that there's kind of three groups, broadly speaking, that came there. There was the racialists, the culturalists, and the confessionalists, and I use those three terms. They were preoccupied with those areas, right? So the culturalists were really preoccupied with cultural and political power, um, and really like, how do we get a voice in national politics? All that sort of stuff. It was the kind of rising of the Christian nationalism movement. We're really thinking about. Then there was like the racialists that were really preoccupied with all the conversations around Jews and white identity and all this. And not all of them are like straight up racist. I'm saying racialists is that's what they're really focused on. And then there's a smaller group of us that were confessionalists, like, man, we need confessional churches. I'd put myself in that place. We need churches that are rooted in historic doctrine. These people are coming into Christianity through sexuality or through the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. They're coming into Christianity from really strange places, and they haven't been discipled. But I saw those three groups, kind of broadly speaking, at my conference, and I thought to myself, man, I don't know if these three groups can hold. I think they're going to pull apart, and you're going to have to kind of decide who you're going to cast your lot with. And I decided, like, I'm not gonna pander to the culturalists or the racialists, even though there are ways we overlapped. I thought that it was pretty clear that there is a purposeful persecution of anyone that's white, a punishing of people that are white. I definitely think cultural war is a necessary implication of being a Christian in the world, but not of it. Um, but it just wasn't where I wanted to place all my effort at all. I thought that's not good, and those groups have really pulled apart pretty intensely, I think, over the last couple of years. And I'm glad that I made the pivot I did at the time, because I just didn't want to get, they were going to go a direction that I didn't want my church to go. And I thought it wouldn't be helpful and healthy for our people. And sure, could I build a really big platform by pandering to those people? The answer is yes, but I thought it wouldn't be stable. I think things would return to a stasis. We're always starting to see a little bit of that in late 2022. And so I got out of that. And now I see other people who weren't willing to switch that have really paid for it, and that they pandered to some more intense elements. And now those elements have shrunk, and they don't have the power that they imagined they would. And and people remember, and those folks, their whole thing is like, we stood up during the pandemic. Well, yeah, you did. I'm just need to let you know that if that's your whole identity, no one cares. And the younger generation is going to forget it really quick, really quick. They're not going to
Yeah.
remember. And so if your entire identity is built around what you did for about a 2 or 3 year period, and that's what you keep, well, I'm not, that guy sold out and he never paid for it. You're right. He did sell out and he never paid for it, but people don't care.
Right.
And you're building your entire thing around, like, well, I was the faithful one. Well, you have to do more than that, man. You were the faithful one, but you didn't build anything stable, steady. And so I think there's a bunch of people that we don't even know about, that have just been building stuff throughout all of this. And I think those are the real winners. The Grimke guys. I've gotten a little more impressed with some of the churches associated with that seminary that I didn't even know existed 18 months ago. But I found out about what some of those guys. I mean, they're more or less the Acts 29 guys that didn't fully go woke or anything like that, but also didn't like pivot hard into Presbyterianism or whatever. Those guys have these some pretty big churches that are really healthy and they're doing really cool things, and no one knows about it. And I
Hmm.
think those are the sort of people that will really start to come onto the scene, and these other folks that were a big deal are just gonna disappear. That's what it seems like is happening right now to me. This is a podcast that is gonna maybe get me into some trouble. So,
We'll see. Well, we're about out of time, but I want to ask you
yep.
one question, and then you can manage your own clock in terms of how when you do. You just
Okay.
tweeted, like I think yesterday, there's another vibe shift. Everybody talks about the
Yeah.
vibe shift. You said there's another vibe shift. I want to hear about the new vibe shift. What is that? And how are people how are people misreading the current moment? And what do you think people should be doing instead? So maybe you can just say as little or as
Yeah.
much as you want on those topics.
So my read, I was thinking about this. I said I'm having a hard time putting this new vibe shift into words, and I still am. But part of it, I would say, people are exhausted of a lot of things, and they're kind of sick of it, and they actually want to move on to something more productive. I do think the constant talk that this or that thing is going to happen, and then it not happening, whatever conspiracy it may be, whatever prediction it may be, and then it doesn't happen, that folks are like, okay, whatever, like who's actually doing something? I want to do something. So I think there's a sort of um, m- people are moving on from a lot of the conversational points. You wouldn't know it if you click on the wrong thing. Man, I clicked on something on X the other day. It messed my entire algorithm up for like 48 hours. Like for 48 hours, I was muting and blocking one thing. Like, I don't care about this. I didn't even know that some of those conversations we're having on X. And I don't think people fully realize how they can fall into a silo, an algorithmic silo, and really have this sense that something's happening that's not. And so I think a lot of people are like, okay, I'm moving on from this. Like I don't really think that this revival of orthodoxy and this revival of Roman Catholicism is going to hold. We'll see. We'll see. I don't think it is. I think people are just going back to that for a moment. But I think people are kind of going back to a stasis out of
Well, I think that's
exhaustion.
it. Pope Leo seems to be, as near as I can tell, I just want to be like a normal Catholic Pope.
Yep.
That
I
seems to
think
be his
that's
shtick so far. I want to be
and
like the South Side guy in Chicago who goes to mass and lives that the Catholic life.
and if he leaned into the more trad cath, I mean it. Some of these guys would like really get excited. But I just think that we're moving back to stasis. And for me as a pastor, I've been really focusing on, like, I'm getting ready to do a series on Proverbs because I realize that people don't understand things like boundaries and how to live a productive, steady life and how to be stable. And people coming out of the pandemic now is like, man, I just want some stability, right? I want something that is really stable. And I think that's part of what's happening right now. And I know I just took a year off from podcasting and came back to it last Monday, and
You just
it
dropped an
was
episode with Mark Driscoll as your
I
first
know.
one. You had Mark Driscoll as your guest. That should get some attention.
Yeah, it definitely provoked some conversation. But so what I think from a pastoral standpoint, I would say is pastors should kind of practice a 80-20 rule. Um, 80% of the time you should just be faithfully going through scripture, teaching the things that are in the forefront of those passages, laying out steady cardinal doctrines, like all the big things, and helping people realize how those things translate into everyday living. Um, and then 20% of the time, swing for the fences. Don't become one of those guys that won't ever touch anything controversial. People want that, and I'm going to talk about evil women when I go through Proverbs chapter 5. That's going to be fun. Um, and but people don't want the diet of controversy anymore because they just have to get back to regular life. They only have so much energy. So pastorally, I'd say that's what we really need right now. Guys that speak to the issues of the day without being totally preoccupied and defined by them. Um, and that's what I think a lot of people are looking for. I think content producers really need to lean into something that's uniquely them in an age of AI. I've really doubled down on. I grew up in the Midwest. I love Indiana. I love Ohio. I love corn. I love fairs. I listen to Tom Petty a whole lot. This is who I am. Here's my stories. And being relatable. I wrote this article about this finger of mine. There it is, called My Crooked Finger, telling a story about how I lost my temper and punched the wall once. I was mad at my son, and I snapped the tendon in my finger, and I decided not to fix it. So I would always be reminded of what anger could cost me or my children, and that was really well received. And I think it's because people are wanting honesty and hope right now, and a lot of the pandemic talk was a new version of David Platt. Funny enough, David Platt's like radical. To be a radical Christian, you got to give up everything. Of course, Platt never did that, but you got to give up everything and go do this thing or that thing, right? And it was this sort of really over the top promise. I think a lot of pandemic, we're taking over and we're doing all this, and they made all these big promises, and then none of that stuff was really manifesting, and it turns out it's like really hard to build institutions. That's why liberals take over them, and
Mhm.
and conservatives are short-sighted in giving up these things. So I think we're in an age of looking for stability, and an age looking for something that I can actually accomplish. um, and that's what I'm focusing on right now. And I think there's a sort of wholesome vibe shift happening because people feel like the whole culture is not burning down because Trump has brought it back to some level of norm, which is a weird thing to say out loud, but that appears to be what's happened. So that's where I'm at right now. I'll have to write on it more and think through it, and I'll be curious to see. It's been interesting watching people interact with your ideas, even in your book. And, like definitely still live in a negative world. There's no way around that. And like looking at CPAC last year should be enough for people to understand that. But, I really thought we'd be in a much more negative world than we were if you had just asked me a year ago, right? A year ago,
Right.
I'd been like, yeah, man, it's going to be bad. We're going to be these persecuted minority, and we are true Christians at this moment are still a minority, a larger minority or a smaller minority than they've ever been, but we're not nearly as persecuted as I thought we would be, and I think we have a respite, a reprieve. um, and the question is, will you build something practical, or will you just be apathetic and go back to normal? A lot of people
Yeah.
are going to be apathetic. That's what they're going to do.
I talked to Tim Keller in 2013, and he was kind of prognosticating the course of culture. And I think there's actually a lot of accuracy in this. He's like, look, we're going through this big negative. Everything is going to be like this big transition we're having to, like, decline of Christianity. But eventually, we're going to land on the other side of that. And Christians in America, they're not going away. We might be something like the cops in Egypt. I don't think he meant that literally, but figuratively, like, you're a minority. A lot of people in the majority don't like you, but you're there. You're part of the culture. You have a place, and it's sort of a little bit stabilized. And so I think we could potentially get there, where eventually all this we go through all the cultural transition, this big wave of cultural transitions. Christianity, the culture is sort of de-Christianized, all these things, whatever it wants to be. Okay, and there's these people over here. They're kind of doing their thing. We don't really like that thing necessarily, but just like all the other many groups in society, they've got it. So I think we could get to something like that. There'd be less
Yeah.
overt hostility, particularly as the threat, the perceived Christian nationalism threat that these guys might actually impose a theocracy, I think is going to recede significantly in the public. I mean, some people will obviously try to keep that fire on, but, like, do you really think that's going to happen? Not very
It's
likely.
it's kind of a boogeyman that they're
Yeah.
using for the moment, but yeah, yeah, crazy times. I wouldn't say that I'm pessimistic or even necessarily optimistic. I'm more like the ground is shifting, things are changing. I'm glad that I have lots of friends that are cut across lots of groups, and I'm listening the best I can to be a faithful pastor where I'm at, and it's going to be a fun couple of years, so.
Yeah. I say that's kind of my perspective is like, in all I see all this conflict of people turning on each other, and I'm like, do you want to make enemies or do you want to make friends? And my perspective is I'd rather make friends. So I try to lean out of the interpersonal conflict, and this, that, and the other thing. I mean, I try to be strategic in what I take on there, because a lot of people are just alienating. You alienate these guys, you alienate these guys, you alienate, and then eventually who's left?
Yep.
And so if you refuse to engage when other people start attacking you, eventually they go away because they didn't get the response they were hoping for. I mean, it
That's
doesn't
right.
always work that way. You know, when people are
Yeah,
accusing you of really bad things, you got to like respond sometimes. But you
yeah.
know, it's like sometimes it's just not necessary to get in a fight with especially every little person on the internet who's trying to build a brand off conflict. Some of these people are so small in the grand scheme of things. I don't even want to be like I, in debate with them at all. Like, what's the point?
Without saying naming names, but everyone know what I mean. I see some boomer pastors argue with these guys online that have like 80 followers or something.
Right?
And these guys have the boomer pastors numbers, right? They really just
Yeah.
know how to push their buttons.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny to watch. But these days I am just trying to really promote the things I care about and encourage anyone that's doing the same thing. And I'm not really interested in making hard critiques of the people to my right. I'm not. So there are people to my right. That's at least what how they perceive it, anyhow. Yeah, I don't practice no enemy to my right, but also I'm not out here trying to prove that I'm the most balanced, level-headed guy. I hate that nonsense, and I'm not gonna. Some of those guys are just going through what we all go through. Um, I've mellowed in my old age, but man, I would fight. I on my Facebook memories, every once in a while, a Facebook post comes up from a younger version of me. It's like 100 comments, and just like arguing about stuff. And I'm like, man, they're just kind of working through it, and I'm not going to get caught up in that. And at the same time, if you're always going after the people a tick to your left, then one day you'll be the only guy on the left, right? If you're always like getting rid of those guys. And so just trying to say, are you confessional? Are you a Christian? Are you attacking things that I have to deal with? And are there other people speaking to this issue better than I am? Uh, and if that's the case, let those other people deal with it if it's a real issue, or if I don't think it's really rises to that level, I'm not going to attack people, even if I disagree with them in a few areas. I'm going to really focus on trying to encourage and strengthen the things that I think are good and matter at this moment. I've kind of done my polemical time. I'm still polemical, but I don't want the whole of my ministry to be looking for the next thing to attack left and right. And I think that's refreshing to some people, and I'll tell you what, it's given me a lot more emotional bandwidth and energy. And every once in a while, Too Late to Vision, I went after him briefly. Every once in a while,
Who?
like Tulian,
Oh
Billy
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Graham's grandson. Yeah, he's just annoying. But every once in a while, I'll jump into the fray. But right now, it's the question is how's it leading towards my greater mission? And if it's not, I don't care. I don't care that people are mad that I don't care, and like you'll get over it. You'll get old too. You'll eventually want to be getting things done. Yeah, it'll happen. You'll catch up, and that's kind of where I'm at.
All right, with that, we'll wrap it up. Michael, thanks so much for joining me. My guest has been Michael Foster, pastor of East River Church in Batavia, Ohio. Good luck selling those transformers.
Yep. Thank you.